In the late 3rd century, the Roman Empire was not just facing barbarian invasions. It was facing a terminal liquidity crisis. The currency was a lie, the silver was gone, and the markets were in freefall. Enter Diocletian, the ultimate imperial CEO, who decided to fix the laws of supply and demand with the edge of a sword. This is the story of the edict on maximum prices, perhaps the most aggressive and disastrous economic intervention in human history. To understand why the Roman economy literally just stopped, we have to look past the burning cities and into the cold, empty vaults of the state treasury. It was not a sudden disaster, but a calculated suicide where the state decided to liquidate its own citizens to pay its debts. But as the silver content of the Roman denarius vanished, the emperors realized that UCA not run a global superpower on copper and promises. The math of the empire had finally broken, and the only solution left was a decree that would turn every merchant into a criminal and every citizen into a prisoner of the state. The Roman economy at its height was a miracle of low transaction costs and high-velocity trade. From the ports of Egypt to the walls of Britain, a single currency allowed for a continental-scale division of labor that would not be seen again for over a millennium. This system relied entirely on the denarius, a silver coin that served as the unit of account for the entire Mediterranean basin. As long as the denarius remained a stable store of value, capital could flow into long-term investments like olive groves, vineyards, and shipping fleets. The empire did not just run on legionnaires. It ran on the confidence that a coin earned in Gaul would hold its value when spent in Ephesus. However, the fiscal requirements of maintaining a standing army of nearly 500,000 men created a permanent deficit that the state was ill-equipped to manage through taxation alone. This structural imbalance forced the central government to look toward the only variable it could control, the purity of the silver itself. The original sin of Roman monetary policy began with Nero, who initiated the first significant debasement of the denarius to fund his ambitious rebuilding projects and military campaigns. By reducing the silver content from nearly 100% to roughly 90%, Nero discovered a way to pay his debts with money he did not actually have. This was not a one-time emergency measure, but the opening of a fiscal Pandora's box that every subsequent emperor found impossible to close. Each new administration faced the same choice: cut military spending and risk a coup, or shave more silver from the coinage. For over a century, the Roman public barely noticed the gradual transition from high-purity silver to a debased alloy. The state was effectively running a multi-generational Ponzi scheme, banking on the fact that the population would continue to accept the face value of the coin regardless of its intrinsic worth. This slow-motion theft worked until the external shocks of the 2nd century pushed the imperial budget past the point of no return. The arrival of the Antonine Plague and the subsequent wars on the Danube created a massive spike in state spending just as the tax base began to shrink. The emperors of the Severan dynasty responded with a desperate, aggressive expansion of the money supply to keep the legions loyal. Septimius Severus famously told his sons to enrich the soldiers and despise everyone else, a directive that required a massive increase in the nominal volume of currency. To achieve this, the silver content of the denarius was slashed to 50%, effectively doubling the money supply while having its purchasing power. This was the moment the Roman state abandoned any pretense of fiscal responsibility in favor of a raw military-industrial complex. The economy began to experience the first waves of true price inflation as the market adjusted to the flood of low-quality metal. Merchants started to distinguish between old silver and new silver, signaling the first major breakdown in the empire's monetary trust. The situation spiraled into total systemic failure during the crisis of the 3rd century, as a rapid succession of barracks emperors fought for control of the treasury. To fund their civil wars, these short-lived rulers debased the currency until the denarius contained less than 5% silver. By the reign of Gallienus, the silver coin was actually a copper slug coated in a thin wash of silver that wore off after a few weeks of circulation. This triggered Gresham's law on a continental scale. Bad money drove the real silver into hiding as citizens hoarded the older, purer coins. The velocity of money collapsed because no one wanted to hold the state's worthless tokens for longer than a few minutes. Transaction costs skyrocketed as trade reverted to primitive barter, effectively erasing centuries of economic specialization. The state was now trying to run a high-tech superpower on a medium of exchange that the public viewed as a fraudulent joke. This monetary collapse destroyed the ability of the state to collect taxes in any meaningful way, leading to a total fiscal insolvency. If the coins were worthless, the state could not use them to buy grain for the city of Rome or equipment for the army. The government began to bypass its own currency, demanding taxes in kind, actual bushels of wheat, liters of oil, and suits of armor. This transition to a liturgy system turned the Roman bureaucracy into a predatory collection agency that prioritized physical assets over financial liquidity. The middle class, which had been the backbone of the urban economy, found itself squeezed between worthless savings and aggressive tax collectors. The empire was no longer a functional trade zone. It was a massive, failing collection agency struggling to feed its own soldiers. By the time Diocletian took power, the Roman economy was a hollowed-out shell of its former self, characterized by hyperinflation and a total lack of investment. Diocletian, a man of military logic rather than economic theory, viewed the skyrocketing prices not as a result of his own debasement, but as the result of merchant greed. He believed that the Roman state could simply command the economy to stop inflating through the sheer force of imperial will. In 301 AD, he issued the Edict on Maximum Prices, a document that attempted to fix the price of every good and service in the empire. It was an unprecedented attempt to micromanage the lives of millions of people through a single, centralized decree. The edict listed over 1,000 items, from the price of a bushel of high-quality wheat to the daily wage of a bricklayer. The state was attempting to freeze the entire Mediterranean economy in a single, static moment of time. The enforcement mechanism for this edict was not a fine or a slap on the wrist, but the immediate application of the death penalty. Anyone caught selling above the mandated price, or even anyone who withheld goods from the market in anticipation of a price rise, was to be executed. Diocletian assumed that the fear of death would be a more powerful motivator than the desire for profit. This was the ultimate supply-side suicide, as the state effectively declared war on the merchant class. The edict ignored the fundamental reality that prices are signals of scarcity and cost. By fixing the price, the state was effectively blinding the market. If it cost more to transport a barrel of wine than the edict allowed it to be sold for, the wine simply stayed in the cellar. The Roman state had criminalized the very act of profitable trade. The immediate result of the edict was not the stabilization of prices, but the total disappearance of goods from the formal market. Merchants and producers realized that selling at the mandated prices meant certain bankruptcy, while selling above them meant a certain death sentence. The logical response was to stop selling altogether, leading to a sudden and catastrophic shortage of basic necessities in every major city. Shops were shuttered, and the bustling marketplaces that had defined Roman life for centuries became ghost towns overnight. The state's attempt to protect the consumer had instead ensured that the consumer had nothing to buy. This created a massive supply shock that hit the urban poor the hardest, leading to the very riots and instability Diocletian had hoped to avoid. The Roman economy did not just slow down. It physically seized up as the circulatory system of trade was severed by the state. As the formal economy evaporated, a massive black market emerged to fill the void, but it operated under a different set of economic rules. Because every transaction was now a capital offense, merchants had to include a massive risk premium in their prices to account for the danger of being caught. This meant that the actual price of goods on the street was significantly higher than it would have been without the edict. The state's intervention had the counterintuitive effect of making everything more expensive while simultaneously making it harder to find. Only the very wealthy or those with political connections could afford to navigate this new, dangerous economic landscape. The average citizen was left with a choice between starvation in the legal economy or poverty in the criminal one. The edict had effectively turned the entire population into a nation of outlaws. The failure of the edict was so rapid and so violent that it was largely abandoned within a few years, but the damage to the Roman social fabric was permanent. The trust between the state and the productive classes was gone, replaced by a relationship of mutual predation. Diocletian's attempt to fix the economy had only succeeded in accelerating its fragmentation into localized, self-sufficient units. The high-risk environment forced people to move away from cities and toward the protection of large, fortified rural estates. This was the beginning of the end for the merchant and artisan classes that had thrived under the Pax Romana. The state had shown that it would rather destroy the market than lose control over it. The Roman economy was no longer a system of exchange, but a battlefield where the state fought its own citizens for the last scraps of real wealth. This period of state violence and economic contraction laid the groundwork for a much darker transition in the Roman world. The government, unable to fix the money, began to fix the people in place to ensure a steady supply of labor and taxes. The freedom of movement that had defined the empire was replaced by a rigid, hereditary caste system designed to prevent the total collapse of the tax base. As the state became more desperate, its audits became more invasive, treating every human life as a mere entry in a cold imperial ledger. The transition from a market-based superpower to a proto-feudal command economy was nearly complete. The empire was surviving, but it was doing so by consuming its own future and liquidating the very prosperity that had made it worth defending. The Roman dream of a unified, prosperous Mediterranean was being replaced by a grim reality of survival at any cost. When the state realized that it could no longer control the price of goods, it decided to do something far more radical. It decided to control the price and movement of human beings who produced them. Diocletian's failure with the edict on maximum prices did not lead to a liberalization of the market, but to a total lockdown of the labor force. The Roman leadership viewed the flight of citizens from the cities and the abandonment of farms not as a rational response to overtaxation, but as a form of economic desertion that had to be stopped by force. If the currency was no longer a reliable tool for mobilizing labor, the state would simply use the law to freeze every person in their current social and economic position. This was the birth of a hereditary caste system where your birth certificate was also your professional death warrant. The Roman economy was no longer a dynamic engine of growth. It had become a vast, stone-walled prison where the only goal was to ensure that the tax collector knew exactly where to find his next victim. The late Roman labor market suffered from a catastrophic contraction of human capital that threatened the very survival of the imperial administration. Decades of civil war, plague, and systemic economic instability had decimated the population, leaving the remaining workforce with theoretically high bargaining power. In a healthy market, this labor scarcity would have driven up real wages, attracting workers to the most productive and essential sectors of the economy. However, the Roman state viewed rising labor costs not as a market signal, but as a direct threat to the fiscal stability of the imperial military. The central government required predictable outputs of grain, uniforms, and weapons at fixed costs that the debased currency could no longer secure. To prevent the collapse of essential services, the state began to replace market incentives with administrative coercion and legal shackles. This shift marked the transition from a society of voluntary exchange to one of state-mandated servitude, where the individual was merely a biological asset of the treasury. But the state did not just want to control the present workforce. It wanted to collateralize the future of every Roman child. The imperial bureaucracy implemented a series of laws that bound sons to the professions of their fathers with mathematical rigidity. If your father was a baker in Rome, or a member of the shipping guild in Alexandria, you were legally prohibited from seeking any other form of employment. This was not a social tradition, but a hard legal requirement enforced by the threat of corporal punishment and asset seizure. The state argued that these compulsory services were necessary to ensure the survival of the Annona, the state's subsidized grain supply that kept the urban masses from revolting. By removing the ability of labor to migrate toward higher wages, the state effectively destroyed the price mechanism for human effort. This created a massive misallocation of talent, as the most capable individuals were trapped in low productivity roles simply because of their lineage. The Roman economy became a static system where the opportunity cost of a wasted life was ignored in favor of short-term logistical certainty. Yet, this freezing of the urban workforce was only the first step in a much broader war against the mobility of the Roman citizen. The military itself became a hereditary occupation, as the sons of veterans were forced into the legions regardless of their aptitude or desire. This policy was a desperate response to the fact that the debased currency could no longer provide a competitive salary for volunteer soldiers. By turning the defense of the empire into a forced family obligation, the state ensured a steady supply of warm bodies at the cost of declining military quality. The professional standards of the high empire were replaced by a weary, conscripted force that viewed service as a life sentence rather than a career. This created a massive systemic friction, where the state had to spend more resources policing its own soldiers than fighting external enemies. As the quality of the military declined, the cost of maintaining it continued to rise, creating a feedback loop of fiscal desperation. The state was now consuming its own human capital to maintain the illusion of imperial strength. This desperation soon turned its gaze toward the most important sector of the ancient economy, the production of food. The agricultural sector, which accounted for over 80% of the Roman economy, was the next target for total labor immobilization. Small independent farmers, known as plebeians, were finding it impossible to survive the dual pressures of barbarian raids and predatory tax collectors. Many of these farmers chose to abandon their land entirely, fleeing to the cities or the wilderness to escape the state's reach. To stop this hemorrhage of the tax base, the state created the legal category of the Coloni, or tenant farmers who were bound to the soil. While technically free citizens, these men were legally prohibited from leaving the land they farmed, effectively becoming the first serfs of the Middle Ages. They traded their liberty to local powerful landlords in exchange for physical protection and a buffer against the imperial tax audit. This was a rational choice for the farmer, but for the empire, it meant the total destruction of a free and flexible labor market. The Roman state had successfully traded its long-term economic vitality for a temporary, brittle stability that relied on the total suppression of human agency. This transition to a frozen society had a devastating impact on the urban centers that had been the engines of Roman prosperity. With labor fixed in place and social mobility criminalized, the incentives for innovation and investment vanished. Wealthy urban elites, known as curiales, were made personally responsible for any shortfalls in tax collection within their districts. If the local population could not pay, the state would seize the personal property of the elites to make up the difference. This turned the most productive and educated class of the empire into a group of desperate fugitives who tried to resign their positions or flee into the clergy. The state responded by making the position of curialis hereditary as well, ensuring that the burden of tax collection would haunt a family for generations. The very people who should have been managing the economy were now being hunted by it as if they were common criminals. The Roman city was no longer a hub of trade and culture, but a collection point for an increasingly violent and extractive central government. The economic result was a society where the risk premium of being a productive citizen had become unmanageable. Why would a merchant invest in a new ship or a farmer improve his irrigation system if any surplus will be immediately confiscated by the state? The sunk cost of the imperial bureaucracy required a level of extraction that the underlying economy could no longer support. The state was effectively liquidating the capital stock of the Mediterranean to pay for its own survival. This created a downward spiral where the more the state tried to control the economy, the more the economy shrank, necessitating even more control. The empire was no longer a living organism. It was a machine that was grinding its own gears into dust. The labor rigidities of the 4th century had turned the Roman world into a series of isolated, stagnant cells where the only thing that moved was the tax collector. And as the state's hunger grew, it developed a new, forensic method of auditing the very lives of its subjects. The Roman state did not just want to know where you were. It wanted to know the exact value of every breath you took and every inch of dirt you stood upon. To achieve this, Diocletian introduced the Capitatio-Iugatio system, a revolutionary and predatory tax engine designed to eliminate any possibility of fiscal evasion. This system merged the head, the person, and the yoke, the land, into a single, taxable unit of production. The state no longer cared about the actual profit of farm made or the health of the farmer. It cared only about the theoretical capacity of the land and the labor attached to it. Every 5 years, and later every 15 years, the state conducted a massive, invasive census known as an indition. These audits were not mere statistical exercises. They were forensic deep dives into the assets of every household in the empire. The state was attempting to map the entire productive capacity of the continent so it could extract every possible cent of surplus. But in its quest for total fiscal transparency, the state created a system that made the very act of survival a liability. The logistics of the Capitatio-Iugatio were a nightmare of bureaucratic overreach that introduced massive systemic friction into the agricultural economy. Tax assessors would count every vine, every olive tree, and every head of cattle, assigning a fixed tax value to each. This value remained constant regardless of weather conditions, crop failures, or localized disasters. If a drought destroyed your harvest, the tax bill remained the same, forcing farmers to sell their equipment or their children into slavery to pay the state. The tax was a negative ROI on the very act of living, as the cost of the audit and the subsequent payment often exceeded the actual yield of the land. This led to the phenomenon of Agri Deserti, or abandoned lands, where farmers simply walked away from their property because owning it had become a death sentence. The state responded not by lowering the taxes, but by forcing the remaining neighbors to pay the taxes for the abandoned land. This policy of Epibol ensured that one farmer's bankruptcy would trigger a domino effect of poverty across an entire village. The phenomenon of Agri Deserti reached such a scale that millions of acres of formerly productive land across North Africa, Gaul, and Italy were left to go fallow. The Roman state viewed this as a form of economic treason and enacted the law of origo, which bound the taxpayer to a specific piece of dirt forever. You were no longer just a citizen of Rome. You were a taxable asset tied to a specific geographic coordinate. If you tried to move to a more fertile region or a city with better opportunities, you were a fugitive from the treasury. This effectively ended the era of the Mediterranean as a unified economic zone and replaced it with a patchwork of localized labor camps. The negative ROI of farming meant that the only way to survive was to produce exactly what you needed for subsistence and hide the rest. The state's attempt to maximize its revenue had instead incentivized the total contraction of the agricultural surplus. This was a fiscal suicide where the state burned its own fields to keep the army warm for a single winter. The indition cycles became the heartbeat of a dying empire, a rhythmic reminder that the state's hunger was the only constant in a failing world. Each census brought a new wave of fear as citizens waited to see how the state would revalue their lives and their labor. The bureaucracy required to manage this system was itself a massive drain on the economy, creating a sunk cost that required even higher taxes to maintain. The tax collectors, often accompanied by soldiers, used torture and imprisonment to extract the required payments from a population that had nothing left to give. This was not a system of governance. It was a military occupation of the state's own tax base. The liquidity crisis of the 3rd century had evolved into a permanent state of fiscal terror. The middle class, which had once provided the administrative and economic glue of the empire, was being systematically liquidated to fund a military that could no longer even secure the borders. The state's obsession with the breadth audit meant that even the most basic human activities were now viewed through the lens of fiscal extraction. Marriage, childbirth, and death were all events that had to be recorded and taxed because they changed the number of heads available for the Capitatio. This level of surveillance was unprecedented in the ancient world and created a deep, simmering resentment toward the central government. The Roman citizen began to view the barbarian invader not as an existential threat, but as a potential liberator from the imperial tax collector. There are documented cases of Roman citizens fleeing across the border to live among the Goths, explicitly stating that the barbarism of the tribes was preferable to the civilization of the Roman tax office. The state had lost its moral and economic legitimacy, relying entirely on the edge of the sword to keep the system functioning. The economy had become a zero-sum game where the state's gain was always the citizen's absolute loss. By the middle of the 4th century, the Roman economy had effectively stopped in every sense that matters for a superpower. Trade was localized, innovation was dead, and the population was legally frozen in a state of hereditary poverty. The transaction costs of simply existing as a Roman citizen had become so high that the system was beginning to collapse under its own weight. The state had successfully built a perfect tax engine, but it had forgotten that an engine requires fuel to run. By liquidating the middle class and shackling the labor force, the emperors had destroyed the very wealth they were trying to capture. The empire was now a hollow shell, a massive military structure sitting on top of a ruined and exhausted economy. The final failure was no longer a matter of if, but when, as the state prepared for one final, desperate liquidation of its remaining assets. The transition from a continental superpower to a collection of isolated, feudal estates was not an accident. It was the inevitable result of a state that chose to survive by consuming its own future. This predatory fiscal engine had one final, unintended consequence. It destroyed the very concept of private property for anyone below the rank of the high nobility. If the state could seize your land, your labor, and your children at any time to satisfy a tax debt, then you did not truly own anything. The only people who could resist the state were the ultra-wealthy senators who maintained private armies on their massive, self-sufficient estates. These men became the new centers of power, offering a grim alternative to the imperial tax audit for the starving masses. The Roman state had inadvertently created the very feudal lords who would eventually replace it. The breadth audit had reached its logical conclusion, where the state had audited its citizens into the arms of its rivals. The stage was now set for the final liquidation of the Roman middle class and the total transition to a barter economy. The final stage of Rome's economic suicide was not a spectacular fire, but a quiet erasure of the very people who made the empire a civilization. By the mid-4th century, the Roman state had successfully hunted down and liquidated its own middle class, treating the urban merchants and local administrators as a one-time resource to be mined until exhaustion. The emperors had built a system where being a productive, civic-minded citizen was no longer a path to prosperity, but a direct liability that invited state-sponsored bankruptcy. As the cities hollowed out and the markets fell silent, the Roman world began to fracture into thousands of isolated, self-sufficient cells that no longer needed the central government to function. The state had become a parasite that had finally outgrown its host, and the only thing left was to witness the final, agonizing collapse of the ancient world's most expensive operating system. This systemic liquidation began with the curiales, the local equity holders of the Roman municipal system who served as the administrative backbone of every city. In the early empire, these positions were highly coveted because they represented social status and local political power. However, as the central government as a fiscal desperation grew, it transformed these local leaders into involuntary tax guarantors for the state. If a city's tax revenue fell short of the imperial assessment, the curiales were legally required to cover the deficit from their personal fortunes. This policy effectively turned the urban middle class into a one-time revenue stream for a failing central treasury. What had once been a position of prestige became a hereditary curse that invited the total seizure of family assets. The state was no longer partnering with the local elite. It was cannibalizing them to maintain a military budget that the economy could no longer support. This predatory shift ensured that the very people who managed the empire's infrastructure were the first to be financially destroyed. The result of this fiscal extraction was a massive barter revolution that saw the middle class abandon the formal Roman currency entirely. When the state demanded taxes in gold or physical goods while paying its own debts in worthless copper, the mercantile class realized that the formal economy was a rigged game. High-purity silver had disappeared into private hoards, and the transaction costs of using the debased state coinage became prohibitive. Merchants began to bypass the urban markets, engaging in direct, localized exchanges of goods to avoid the gaze of the tax collector. This retreat from the monetary system led to a rapid death of economic specialization across the Mediterranean. If you could not trust the medium of exchange, you could no longer afford to be a specialist who relied on trade for basic needs. The empire's sophisticated division of labor was being replaced by a primitive, low-velocity system of survival. This death of specialization created a massive amount of systemic friction that made continental trade nearly impossible. Without a reliable currency, the cost of transporting goods across long distances became higher than the potential profit from the sale. A merchant in Gaul could no longer easily buy grain from Egypt because there was no longer a common, trusted unit of account to facilitate the swap. This forced every region to become autarkic, producing its own food, tools, and clothing regardless of local efficiency. The Roman world was essentially de-globalizing, trading the benefits of a massive trade zone for the safety of local subsistence. This contraction of the market meant that the state's revenue base was shrinking even faster than the population. The empire was no longer a market. It was a collection of survivalist bunkers. As the urban middle class faced total liquidation, they began to flee the cities in a search for tax shelters. This led to the rise of the great estates, or villas, which functioned as self-sufficient, tax-exempt economic fortresses. These estates were owned by the high senatorial nobility, who possessed the political leverage to ignore imperial tax decrees and maintain their own private security forces. For a bankrupt merchant or a starving farmer, these estates offered a logical trade. They would surrender their land and freedom in exchange for physical safety and a life outside the imperial tax audit. These villas became the new operating units of the Roman world, producing their own resources within a closed loop. The central government found itself unable to extract revenue from these powerful enclaves, further shrinking the tax base and increasing the pressure on those who remained. The state had effectively subsidized the creation of a rival economic system that would eventually render the empire obsolete. The sunk cost of the imperial court only accelerated this downward spiral as the bureaucracy continued to expand even as the revenue streams dried up. To manage the increasingly complex systems of tax collection and labor control, the emperors hired more officials, who in turn required more taxes to pay their own salaries. This administrative bloat created a negative ROI for the entire imperial project, where the cost of governance exceeded the value it provided to the governed. The imperial court became a massive, isolated consumer of wealth that produced nothing but decrees and audits. By the late 4th century, the Roman state was a distressed asset that was being stripped of its remaining value by its own management. The emperors were no longer trying to grow the economy. They were simply trying to delay the inevitable liquidation of the state. Every new tax was a desperate attempt to buy another month of military loyalty at the expense of the empire's long-term survival. This period of calculated suicide saw the Roman state trade its long-term economic freedom for another century of military survival. The leadership in Rome and Constantinople viewed economic vitality as a luxury they could no longer afford in the face of persistent external threats. They traded the mercantile energy of the Mediterranean for a brittle, high-cost military apparatus. This was a rational choice for an emperor who feared a palace coup or a barbarian breach, but it was a terminal mistake for the economy. By liquidating the merchant class and shackling the labor force, the state had removed the only engine that could generate the wealth needed to pay for the army. The empire was now a zombie corporation, surviving on the momentum of its past glory while its internal organs were failing. The final collapse was not caused by the strength of the invaders, but by the total insolvency of the defender. The barbarian takeover should be viewed not as a simple conquest, but as a low-overhead competition in the market for security. The Germanic tribes that crossed the Rhine and the Danube were not burdened by a massive, centralized bureaucracy or an expensive imperial court. They were lean, mobile, and decentralized, allowing them to offer local populations protection at a much lower tax rate than the Roman state. For a provincial landowner, paying 10% of his crop to a local Goth chieftain was a much better deal than paying 50% to a distant and predatory Roman emperor. The barbarians were effectively market disruptors who broke the Roman monopoly on power by offering a more sustainable fiscal model. Many Roman citizens viewed the arrival of the tribes as a form of debt relief or a bankruptcy filing that finally cleared the imperial ledger. The distressed asset of the Roman province was simply being acquired by a new management team with lower operating costs. This transition marked the final system failure of the Roman world, as the central government lost the ability to command resources or loyalty. When the Vandals seized the grain-producing regions of North Africa, they did not just take land. They took the empire as primary revenue stream. The Roman state, already operating at a massive deficit, could no longer afford to pay the mercenaries who were its only remaining defense. The liquidation was now physical, as the army dissolved and the administrative centers were abandoned. The operating costs of the empire had finally reached a point where no amount of taxation or debasement could cover the bill. Rome did not fall because it was weak. It fell because it was too expensive to exist. The ancient world's most complex economic system had finally run out of other people's money. The cold ledger of history provides a clear lesson. You cannot outrun the laws of supply and demand with a sword. The Roman emperors tried to use state violence to fix prices, freeze labor, and extract wealth, but they only succeeded in destroying the market they relied upon. Every intervention created a new mercantile friction that slowed the velocity of trade and increased the cost of survival. The transition to the Middle Ages was not a sudden tragedy, but a necessary system reboot that cleared away a century of state-mandated economic insanity. By decentralizing power and returning to a localized, barter-based economy, the survivors of the Roman collapse were able to rebuild a more sustainable, albeit more primitive, society. The Dark Ages were merely the period when the economy learned how to function without a predatory central bank. The state's attempt to maintain a global superpower through asset stripping and currency manipulation eventually reached its logical conclusion. When the value of a citizen's labor is entirely consumed by the state, the citizen no longer has any incentive to support the state's existence. The barbarians did not have to break the door down. The Roman people simply stopped holding it shut. The collapse of the Western Empire was the final liquidation of a business model that had been insolvent for over 100 years. The resulting fragmentation of Europe allowed for a new, more competitive market of ideas and governance to eventually emerge. This was the high price of a system that forgot that wealth must be created before it can be taxed. The ledger of Rome was closed with red ink, leaving a permanent record of what happens when a state decides to war against its own economy. Ultimately, The story of Rome as economy is a warning about the limits of fiscal extraction and the dangers of monetary debasement. When a state begins to treat its productive citizens as a one-time resource to be mined, it ensures its own eventual liquidation. The sunk cost of a massive, unproductive bureaucracy will eventually overwhelm even the most prosperous society if it is not checked by market reality. Rome's economy did not just stop. It was strangled by a state that refused to accept that it was broke. The final balance sheet showed an empire that had traded its future for a few more years of military survival, leaving nothing but ruins and a hard-earned lesson for those who followed. History shows that a state can survive a war, but it cannot survive a permanent deficit of trust in its currency and its laws. The ledger is finally closed, and the results are non-negotiable.